Welcome back to Conversations at the Leaky Cauldron, Episode 4, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Chapters 15 through 17, Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, the Goblet of Fire, and the Four Champions. And back with me are my esteemed colleagues, Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wes Schantz. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having us back.
Hi.
It's good to have you back on this special Christmas episode, just about a week before Christmas here, and just before we take our hiatuses, our hiati, and go on to our various Hobbit burrows and Hogsmeades and the burrows, and or go through various cupboards or not cupboards, as it were. And so I'm looking forward to talking about these two new schools, this Goblet of Fire thing, and this, again, motif of 3 and 4 being upset, or 3 being upset by 4, and what that means. And, what did y'all, and also we wanted to talk a little bit about Christmas gifts we would like to receive in the form of charms, and a little bit about that. But so where would y'all like to start today?
Well, I mean, just looking back at Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, which I like that pronunciation. I don't know if it's right, but that sounds good to me. I think I've mentioned before that I really sort of missed in these books a sense of the bigger world, right? It's very England focused or UK focused anyway. But in these chapters, we do finally, I mean, in this book as a whole, with all of the sort of international component to it, but in these chapters in particular, we do kind of get a sense of that that international, those other wizarding traditions and cultures out there. So I was kind of interested in that, interested in the language aspect of it. I didn't look up Beauxbatons, but just looking at the word, I can take a guess at what it might mean. And Durmstrang, that's a pretty interesting allusion as well. To a historical, cultural movement. But anyway, those are some aspects that I was particularly keen on discussing with you guys. Does that sound like an okay place to start?
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in with Beauxbaton. I think clearly comes from sort of French, and it means something like pretty stick. So it's supposed to be meaning something, the idea that these are beautiful, these people are ornate, and they come in an ornate sort of golden Pegasus drawn chariot, a Cinderella-like image out from the sky, and they come from the sky, whereas Durmstrang comes from below. So there are a couple of antinomies. And these are drawn out more, I would say, even in the movie, where Durmstrang is red and Beauxbaton is blue, and that's maintained here. Durmstrang is Germanic in speaking. Durmstrang is, in fact, a Germanic word, and you could tell us some about the movement. And Beauxbaton is a French, Anglo word. They were against each other in World War II, but allies to the Brits, and that's interesting to think about. And in the movies, only girls come from Beauxbaton. It's like they clean up the mythology somewhere, make it more mythological. And the men, or Durmstrang only brings men, but that's not how it is in the book. And also, not only does Durmstrang come out from the sea in a ship, so does Beauxbaton come out from the sky in a chariot, a home sort of thing. And also, the Durmstrang contingent breathes fire, whereas the Beauxbaton girls are, they seem to be drifting water, at least in the movie. But that's not how it is. It's almost as if the movie is like the imaginary idea of how each of the house would be that the real characters have in the books. Because, you have the Beauxbaton people shivering. You have the Victor Crumb has a cold for Durmstrang. It's all very normal. Well, I just wanted to mention those antinomies and symbolically what these new schools might also represent, as well as sort of their international sort of presence. What do you think, Sarah?
I mean, I too found like the names interesting. I don't know that I have much more to share. I think, the teachers for each of them are interesting, and I think Alex, you sort of prefigured this in our conversation last week, but about some of the like maybe more guttural or earthy sounds of the English language can be found in like the way that they speak from Durmstrang. Wes, I think I know what artistic movement you're talking about, but for the listeners, can you maybe talk a little bit about what you saw in the name and how that relates maybe to what you saw in the book, or not really sure?
Yeah. No, all I know is that Durmstrang, like lots of German words, is like a combination of separate words. And so the Durm part is storm and the strong part is stress. I might have that backwards. But anyway, so it's translated as storm and stress. And it's a kind of romantic era movement of this kind of desire for something that's more dramatic, more like deeply felt. I don't know the specifics, honestly, beyond that, but that it sort of really fits with the way that the Durmstrang students are presented as being coming out of their sort of sunken ship mode of transport, right, out of the deeps, that they, as Malfoy points out for us, right, they have a much harder line on the racial component or the sort of the magical, non-magical, like racism, essentially, that we see at play here, that they don't allow mudbloods in their school, right? So there's that sort of darker element of the nationalism that comes out of that romantic period. And with that, like the very interest in languages and like roots of languages and starting to trace those, a lot of that sort of comes to the fore around that same time as people sort of seize upon language as a great kind of drawing, like a force that would draw people together around, to bind them around a cultural identity, right? And so in the,
do you think?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, just to underscore that, I mean, between the two visiting headmasters, Karkaroff is the one who is in chapter 17, I think, the most resistant to the idea that Hogwarts gets two champions.
Yeah.
Like the way that he spoke about it was that the tournament was like, in a way, like to bring honor to the school, like just that it was this collective, it would be this collective victory, like a win for the one would be a win for the whole. Whereas I don't think that that's exactly the vibe that I got, the way that Dumbledore was describing the tournament. I mean, maybe I missed that, but, a $1,000 prize is a very individual prize. It's not as though some victory reward, serves the school in the next round. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to underscore your point.
That's a really interesting point, because it makes me wonder to what extent, because there is a way to read Harry Potter as sort of the figure of the hero that can be embodied at any point, as if he is not really a real character so much as sort of like a figure like Jesus, or like an archetypal figure that can be embodied at moments. And so the fact that he's the fourth champion, and I might be, and the fact that he's the fourth champion might represent something like Hogwarts, in playing host to this competition, wins twice. Similar to the point you're making, but different, and that just hosting this is itself a win for civilization, is itself like the height of civilization, its own reward. And that's what Harry as a champion might represent, whereas the three normal champions, sort of like John as like the synoptic extra gospel, whereas the other three kind of get the facts right, or to, or at least to whatever extent that's, true within that sphere. I don't know, but I'm trying.
That's a really interesting
comparison. Interesting.
I thought about that too with respect to Hogwarts, what's going on with them having the two champions. And I kind of feel like, Hogwarts seems to be the most diverse of the three schools. Within Hogwarts, it has the four houses. We don't get a sense that either of these other schools has that level of internal diversity and embrace of sort of individual specialties, right, which sort of bring you together with other people, and then you all are sort of bonded within this larger overarching, the school as a whole, right? Hogwarts just seems to have a lot more going on than either of the other two, which yeah, they do seem kind of juxtaposed against one another, Durmstrang versus Beauxbaton, whereas Hogwarts is kind of its own thing. And then so it sort of makes sense then that within Hogwarts they'd have multiple champions, especially when you consider that one of those champions is Harry Potter, who sort of breaks the mold in all sorts of ways, to the point that someone like Snape deeply resents it. Even his best friend Ron, by the end of this reading that we did for today, Ron is really starting to feel that in his own way. That sort of mistrust, that offense, right? Taking offense at Harry being so special. That's one of the most interesting things. See, this is why I feel like Ron, you guys don't give him enough credit, Sarah, but he's a super interesting character here.
I'm just kidding.
Well, that's sort of interesting because I think often people start to trace the sort of line of the budding sexuality of the characters in this story. And I think that is there because you have this obviously very masculine, Karkaroff-driven Durmstrang force, and even like that masculine Germanic nature. In fact, the Germans call their land the fatherland, like the Romans did, and after the Roman convention, and that's why they adopt the eagle as well. And why we adopt the eagle in America, by the way. But Beauxbaton, and being more French and more beautiful language, their champion is a woman. And something interesting about them is that they have hybrids. They are more liberal in that they allow a hybrid headmaster, which is not even true of Hogwarts, right? We have Hagrid, who is half giant, half man, who is on the staff, but even that he is looked down upon by Malfoy, the Slytherin contingent within the Hogwarts. But we have someone who is half, I believe, giant, risen to the highest position at this school. And then, of course, their champion is half Fila, which we'll find out later. And so I think it's also interesting to note that these characters are starting to become more masculine and feminine and see more elements of masculine and femininity, but that we see one element of budding masculinity in men is like recognition of inferiority or resentment of the success of those around oneself. Because man, Ron, you only, like, while he dotes on Crumb only because he is good at Quidditch, he claims that Hermione only likes Diggory because he is handsome, ostensibly because Ron is not handsome, and feels like her calling Diggory good means she is saying that Diggory is more handsome than Ron, and thus she likes him more. And that's such an interesting, confused issue. And the fact that there's a further distinction between Ron and Harry getting, again, more and more famous and incredible. Ron, it's like in direct proportion with Ron's budding or blooming resentment.
Yeah. We get, in that moment that Ron claims that people, like Hermione only looks up to Cedric Diggory because he's handsome, right? We get a mention there of Lockhart.
Yes.
It's one of the few allusions, I think, to previous books that goes without any further comment from the narrator. That's just like, it's just kind of there for us to note if we've read it recently enough to remember who Lockhart was and what went on with him, which we do, but it's really, I think it does strike me that Ron recalling that in this moment, it sort of like throws his character into sharper relief, as you say, right? He becomes a kind of foil for these other characters who are gaining such stature before our eyes. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I really could relate to Ron more so than I could relate to any other character,
Sure.
except maybe Neville or Professor Binns or somebody, right? But because Ron is so normal, like he's sort of like the straight man in the whole thing, that you can, he's just a normal dude. He likes, sports, and he's not particularly good at anything really. He has been loyal, very loyal and very tough, and stood by his friends. But once he feels like his friends aren't standing by him, well, then that just makes it all the worse for him, right? And I think you can really feel that here. In a way, I again would compare him to Snape, that he feels sort of left out, sort of left behind or betrayed, and Snape for me Snape is the most interesting character in the series. So anything that makes Ron a little more like him is a plus in my book.
Well, two things about that. I'm interested to what extent this is a call to distinction for Ron, and that he has sort of been reveling in sort of a participation mystique, sort of the victories of others, like the Chudley Cannons and his family, like Percy and Bill and Charlie and Harry, his friend, and Hermione. But now he is starting to sort of differentiate and realize these are their victories, their talents. He needs to sort of do something for himself. But I also want to ask about Hermione and her budding political aspirations and how she's going about it. And also the fact that Hagrid, Fred, and George, all based on experience of the house elves in the kitchens, which she does not have, flatly refused to join SPEW, SPEW, saying that it would be a crime because some house elves like working down there. And she says, but what about Dobby? And even Hagrid says, there are weird ones in every breed. So what do we think about Hermione continuing to, she's really very much developing in this direction now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that her activism with SPEW reveals is maybe the trajectory of social awakening, or social, like the various stages that someone goes through to maybe become genuinely socially conscious. Because I think there is a stage at which you think you know what's better for the whole, right? Or sometimes you mistake your moral judgment for the judgment of others. And to me, like we've said all along, that Hermione is so advanced. Like, I'll be honest, this is like what she is experiencing and kind of embodying is something that my friends from college and we were all guilty of,
Right.
Surely we
Yes.
know what's best for this one large swath of people that in our estimation is impoverished or oppressed or whatever. But I've never walked a mile in their shoes. I've never passed the microphone, that's something that that's pretty popular nowadays in activism circles, is this idea that you don't need people from positions of power to speak for you or be your voice, your vocare for you. You need to pass the mic, and sit down, shut up, and listen. And given that, I don't necessarily think that Hagrid, Fred, and George are any more right, but to resist her SPEU membership, to say well, listen, I've talked with house elves, because I'll be honest, that's an argument that was used that's an argument that's used to perpetuate a lot of oppressive systems. Well, they like it, or it's good for them, or we give them holidays, or their argument isn't good either, right? But it does expose a flaw in her reasoning, or in her, like, I don't know, in her development here. I'm not certain that either one of them are I think they're presented as like ways of thinking about injustice, right? Like hers is coming from this moral framework and she's applying it to what she sees. And theirs is, here's what I know. And I think theirs is more of a, if it doesn't seem like it's broken, I'm not going to try to fix it. I think Hagrid is the most interesting here because of the four of them, he and Hermione are the most likely to experience prejudice on their own because of who they are. And I don't know, I think for Hermione, it makes her acutely aware of the ways in which other people are kept lower, and maybe by virtue of Hagrid's uniqueness, like he's not around a lot of other people like him. He doesn't really seem to pick up on the ways in which he is put down by people. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he's just so big and beefy, like he just doesn't care. But he doesn't really seem to feel prejudice the same way that Hermione does. I don't know if that makes any sense. But
it's interesting because what you said, I mean, it's so insightful and interesting, but Jean Piaget, a constructivist psychologist, actually says and writes in his developmental stages that people go through a messianic stage. And it does seem to be that sort of college stage, especially at, say, a Catholic or a Jesuit university like you and I went to, you at Notre Dame and me at Marquette, where that's actually really promoted, right? That spirit of going out there and doing something and helping the world. And so there's sort of a conflation between doing good and, learning how to do good, right? Because sort of the spirit of wanting to do good is rewarded without sort of learning just how difficult it is systemically
absolutely
to make something better. Like there's a big difference between me wanting to heal people and becoming a psychologist. Like I have to build that skill if I actually want to help rather than hurt somebody. And I think it's very brilliant what you're saying, that it's like there's a lot of the right intention going around, and especially when we were young, and especially in our generation that is now getting to its early 30s, that perhaps the focus was too broad, and we need to maybe bear down in a deeper way, in a smaller way. Think smaller.
Well, and this isn't to I mean, I'm a FJV, a former Jesuit volunteer, and like I would never go so far as to suggest that, service programs and service experiences, especially ones that are paired with learning, and especially when they are like really well organized, prepared, and executed, when there's somebody in a position to like expose young people to like systems and their role in them, and you do learning before and action and then reflection, and most of the action, in all honesty, like it should be listening and the ministry of presence and all of that, which is all of the stuff that Hermione is totally forgetting or doesn't even know, right? I've seen a lot of like mediocre service programs, right? Not a lot. Certainly the ones at Gonzaga were really good, but where like there's this substitution of my voice for their voice, and it's born of pity and not born of a sense of like kinship or solidarity. That like if Hermione could articulate, my liberation is built and tied into theirs, and I am, hers. It's not from a place of. I hesitate to be critical of her, but
I think you're right.
But I think part of the process of, I'm interested in this psychologist that you mentioned, Alex, because I think part of the process of figuring out like the right way to contribute to like the common good means going through this process of seeing oneself as different from the other that you are attempting to serve, and then kind of almost being surprised in your discovery that you are actually no different than they are. And that like that kinship is really, it seems like something that's born only out of error. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that like, I discover that I am intimately tied, my welfare, my salvation is intimately tied to that of someone whose society would not put in the same box as me. And it's almost like I learned that really only fundamentally by at first overlooking it. And then so maybe that messianic impulse is something that like, I don't know, that there's something good about that. There's something healthy, maybe particularly if it is temporary, if it's then checked by something else. I mean, this is all getting quite theoretical. I'm not really just talking about Hermione. I'm more talking about myself, but
yeah.
I think it's interesting too, like the differences between Hermione's motivations for wanting to free the elves. Like, it seems to me that she's struck by, in a way, like you're describing, like she's struck by her own complicity, her own unaware benefiting, like from these elves the whole time she's been at Hogwarts, and only now realizing that they're there at all, right? And that seems to be part of what's so shocking to her. Like she stops eating for a few days there, and again, Ron is there to point out like her hypocrisy about saying, okay, like I found a better way to help them. Oh no, you've just gotten like hungry enough to need to eat, right? But so on the one hand, there's that. There's also like her copious reading, you know, like she's very steeped in history and has read all the books. And now she's realizing, oh no, like the books leave stuff out. You know, the history of Hogwarts doesn't mention the house elves at all. So it's not like, that comes crumbling down a little bit. Like that's kind of part of her whole self-concept is like, I know a lot of stuff because I read a lot of books. Well, oh shoot, like the books don't know as much as maybe someone who opens their eyes and looks around a little bit at school. So there's that. But then there's also her experience with the elf Winky, right? And in that respect, she is kind of like as he's describing, like she's putting a kind of concept over Winky rather than like seeing who Winky actually is and what she might actually want and need, and like how her situation is unique with the master that she has, and how Dobby's situation, being who he was and with the master he had, was also unique, you know? And so it's just like, it's much more complicated than she's able to sort of conceptualize at this point. She's working under like very good intuitions and motivations, but that her information, as we've seen with lots of things in these stories, right, her information is not all there yet, and she hasn't quite got it together yet.
That's great.
You know,
Wes. I think I see two great things there. One, when you say she's putting an idea on Winky, I think you see that's literally the Jungian idea of projecting. And so what she seems to be projecting is her idea of herself onto this house elf. Look how pitiful it would be if I were in that situation. And when she does this, like you say, she doesn't see the complex relationship of the house elf to the person. She imagines essentially what the relationship must be based on this single interaction and develops a narrative based on that, in which case this house elf is being oppressed rather than investigating the situation, which she could start investigating by going to the kitchens, which is what I think is the sort of point that Fred, George, and Hagrid make. I think they're not making a rational argument in the same way that Hermione is making what I would call a rationalist argument. While also, I would also potentially say, do you think she is projecting this image onto the house elves because she is seeing herself in them as oppressed, because she has recently come into consciousness of the fact that she is a mudblood in, or by some measures in this world. That in the last book that was sort of brought to light, or rather in the second book. And so since the second book, she's been sort of fighting for hybrid creature rights, or for the rights of magical creatures. And I wonder if that's because she sort of sees an identity between herself and these creatures that is both there, but also very much not there in the same way that she might initially presume.
Well, so I think it's entirely possible that she's right, that the house elves are oppressed, right? Like, I think it's very possible that her intuition is accurate. We're right to point out, like, the flaws maybe in her pattern. And, you know, by saying, like, oh, well, they really like their oppression, I'm really hesitant to take that argument, because, I mean, that argument was made about slaves, too. And, like, that's just kind of ugly. But
that argument already
I
assumes that they're being
that, like,
oppressed, right? Because it hasn't actually been admitted that they're oppressed in Hogwarts. That's been Hermione's assumption. The idea is that they work there. She's always just called them slaves. So we don't yet have confirmation that they are being oppressed, and that that's a bit of sort of generous interpretation by Hagrid, Fred, and George, who I would say are not generally the sorts of people who are going to give sort of rose-colored interpretations either. Fred and George have mapped the space of that place very well, and Hagrid cares more about every living creature than anybody we know, including Hermione. It's his entire job. So I don't know that putting them in the place of blithe German citizens is exactly appropriate, just because these are not the sorts of people who generally would say that sort of thing lightly. And they do have experience that Hermione lacks at this point. So I think they're pointing the finger at what the next step is, rather than saying that she's wrong. I think she's just moving to the wrong position on the board. And that's sort of, so I guess I'm agreeing that I think is her problem. And not that the house elves don't need help, but that if she is going to help them, she needs to investigate who they really are first.
Right. Yeah, no, and I definitely agree that, like, the way that you characterize, like, what do we know of Hagrid and Fred and George, that they don't really have an agenda one way or the other, at least for Fred or George, but Hagrid is deeply caring of living creatures, and I totally take that. I think maybe that makes it even more obvious than that, like, what he would want to do is forge relationships like a good, you know, community organizer.
Yeah.
But, like, her method, her means are insufficient to the matter, right? But, like, I do think that that what you were saying earlier is interesting when you take this particular thread of plot as a part of the bigger whole, like the assumptions being made about different kinds of people because of where they come from or what they do or how they look or how they speak, and that, like, we've sort of up until this point, like, Hermione, there's been nothing that she can't do, right? And nothing that it seems like she and we're not going to necessarily see her make, you know, deep and glaring judgments about other people that she has to learn to, you know, overcome. But I think it points out that with the arrival of these two other groups of people who have different accents and different outfits and different traditions, that, like, it'd be really easy to think that there's one person who represents them. I mean, the whole point of the tournament is that there's, like, one representative from every school, but that, like, Victor Crumb isn't all Durmstrang students, and Karkaroff isn't all Durmstrang teachers, and, like, They're not all, like, one of them doesn't represent Bulgaria. And yet it's
Right.
interesting that like just 5 or 6 chapters ago, you had 7 athletes who represent their country in a, like, it's one thing to wear the flag of your country in an athletic contest. It's another thing altogether to say that you speak for an entire group of people, and that, like, this international magical cooperation thing that they're engaging in is, among other things, designed to maybe teach them in a lot of different ways the ease with which we make assumptions about people, and, like, the problems that come from that. I don't know.
I think you're nailing it. I think
that might be a little reductive.
Well, no, but that's interesting because the Jungians do say that is the first way when you meet the unknown that you grasp that which you do not understand. You project an imaginary image, sort of a first pass approximation, which is very general, like a fairy tale, right? And then you chisel away at that to find the particulars as you come to understand a situation, event, sport, or person, or narrative better. So that's sort of what we're doing in this sort of seminar, right? We have sort of general ideas on themes and some hypotheses at first, but then the sort of structure of the narrative starts to lay itself out in front of our eyes and gets more particular. And I think what you're showing us is that sort of, if we want to actually help rather than appear that we're helping, we can't just stop at our projection and say there are bad things. We have to actually develop a sophisticated understanding of a situation and the tools necessary to work within a sophisticated situation, because that's what it's going to take to fix any problem that requires a human to fix it, because that means a conscious intellect. And I think you're really putting your finger on something here, in that we all need to get much more sophisticated as thinkers and as doers and as skilled beings to deal with the problems of today, rather than to just comment on them. But yeah, Wes, what do you? Yeah.
I really like the point about the representative nature of this this kind of theme, where on the one hand you have Hermione kind of working off of a pretty limited actual experience with house elves, and so doing a lot with a very few representatives, right? And then you have this idea that each of the schools is going to be represented by somebody. The different heroes or champions or whatever. It's always cool to think about how each story kind of has its hero, right? And then you also can think about what happens when a bunch of those heroes come into conflict with one another. And that's something you get with superhero movies. After a while, there's no more villains for the heroes to fight, so then pretty soon you have the heroes fighting other heroes, for whatever reason, right? And you see this too with the kind of large scale cultural arguments that we get into, Western culture and Eastern culture, or Middle Eastern culture, right? And so then you have you pit these conceptions, these representative ideas against one another, and see what happens with that. We get that kind of dramatized here, where to this point in the story, Harry Potter is clearly the hero, and there's this odd moment where he sees himself as being rather a small person with respect to the initial 3 champions. They're grown up essentially, right? They're basically of age, whereas he's still a kid. That idea that the representative needs to grow, needs to sort of develop and come into contact with others to sort of fully unfold or something. I found that really, really interesting. And with Hermione's kind of her side story here, I like that as a way to see how it kind of connects with the main story, right? That she's encountering this problem of needing more experience, and Harry is coming into the same kind of problem, although, he hasn't really intended to take this mantle of hero on himself this time. It's thrust upon him, and he's as surprised as anyone. I find that really, really interesting.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, I mean, just something I was thinking about, a comment you made earlier, Wes, and I recall you being very interested, and this is something we talked about a little bit yesterday with the Final Fantasy VII and 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the different iterations or clones that dance about the same theme, and how you were sort of taking that line with Harry Potter, it seems so, where you were like, man, these first couple books are very similar with some small changes, and some of them seem a bit arbitrary in order just to make a change. And I was wondering whether you felt like that the series itself was sort of alchemically transforming in this fourth book. And we've been dancing around this theme, I think, too, that it's been going from sort of like kids' book that might make some money and could be a series to bang, this is the franchise quarterback. This is the series book. Now it has become something bigger than just a novel or two about a boy, but is now going to take place in sort of a cosmic place. There's going to be a cosmic struggle, and it's taking itself seriously. And I wonder if that's almost what the Triwizard Tournament is a metaphor for, that the competition has been accepted, or that the arena has been entered by the piece of literature itself too, and that's what Harry Potter is. This piece of literature attempting to sort of transform the values of a civilization, or at least to represent them, and to transform itself into that sort of mirror of a civilization.
Yeah. I mean, I could speculate, I guess, that, something actually shifts with the fourth book, where maybe Rowling has a bit more control over the final product. She maybe, feels freer to write a more mature story. I don't know enough about like her statements about her own work or other people who have studied this more. I'm sure they could answer with a little bit more clarity, but I certainly get that sense, at least from reading it. It does feel like a bigger undertaking here, and in a way like a fresh start of the series as well, where we kind of saw pretty distinct parallels from books 1, 2, and 3, which are being modified drastically here in book 4, where we've kind of unfolded the world and looked at some other aspects of it that were really not there before. We've had some new characters just kind of pop in out of nowhere, and so now the cast of characters is way bigger. The setting has expanded drastically. So yeah, in lots of ways, it does feel like a much more grandiose kind of thing. And we, coming into it from those cozy first 3 books, we feel a bit disoriented probably as we're like standing in this enormous structure. But, at the same time, we're equal to it. Like we can kind of gather our wits and proceed. There's enough there that we've been kind of given from the first 3 books. There's enough helps along the way here in the 4th book to kind of lead us into it. Now, the more interesting thing that sort of occurs to me about that is like, to what end are we being drawn? And I think you guys have both kind of touched on this tonight, like with your discussions of service within a Catholic superstructure, right? Like, if we're being drawn into this book, like Harry Potter is drawn into the tournament, like, to what purpose is that? Is there an overarching theological purpose at stake here? Is there an overarching political purpose that the author has? Is she just trying to tell a good story, a relevant, an interesting story? What is going on here? And this kind of might bring us to like our Christmas theme tonight too. Like, I think you were asking Alex if there is such a thing as Santa Claus or Father Christmas in the wizarding world, or or Jesus Christ for that matter, right? Because they seem to celebrate Christmas, but we don't get a whole lot of religious talk per se. I don't know. Just to kind of open that can.
If I could just say that, like, just to add, one of the things we talked about last time was like 3 being complicated by 4, and this is like we've said, this is the 4th book. I really liked how you phrased it though, Wes, about like the first 3 laying out a really complex geography and cast of characters, and it's like maybe something about the 4th one that like sets it in motion, that I think of a bunch of things that we read and studied and like worked on at St. John's where, you can freeze frame a world or an idea or a problem, but putting it in time and like pressing go and letting it run its course, I think is like, I don't know, it's much more alive that way. And it's also like, it's the middle. And I think there's quite a bit that I've read about like a chiasmic or chiasmic structure of some of these, of the series, where there's like pieces of 1 and 7 that are thematically or linguistically a mirror to one another. And the same is true of 2 and 6. Like there's some elements that echo one another, but there would be nothing to echo if that's the case in book 4. It's like it's separate unto itself. It's like the center, maybe the crossing point. I'm not sure, but I think like in also in terms of how you phrased your question about like tying this to Christmas, like just it really seems like I don't know. Maybe it's because it's Advent or whatever, but like the idea of okay, now things are really getting started is sort of what I feel when I read or listen to this book. Like now things are getting serious. Now things are getting grave. Like stakes are raised. And it's not that they weren't high in various places in the past, but with this book, it seems like there's problems at every other chapter, as opposed to one giant battle at the end. And villains are emerging in a lot of different places, including within the heart of various, like, seemingly good characters. I just, it seems like things are being incarnate. And that's the word that I keep coming back to, that like something that was set out or laid out outside of time is now being like put in time and like press go and get started.
That's perfect. That sounds exactly like what is going to be happening literally at the end of this text. Something is going to become finally embodied, which we have not even been able to put into words. And so the embodiment will actually precede the naming of it, interestingly enough. But y'all, I think this was one of our best conversations yet, but I suppose we have to end with a Christmas treat, something to fill the stockings of the listeners with. And so this time around, I think we decided that the best gift you can give someone would be a nice little spell like a charm. And our sort of reason behind that as teachers was that what's better than the gift that keeps on giving? And what is the gift that keeps on giving? Well, a skill that you teach somebody. And so what if you could either receive or give a charm to someone? So I suppose we have to see whether you're feeling like you're in a giving or a generous mood, or rather a receiving or a generous mood. What would you want the charm to do? I have a certain idea in mind. I'm in a receiving mood as a disagreeable person. And I already have a pretty strong idea, but Wes, do you have an idea?
I think I'm interested in the idea of missed opportunities. Just kind of generally, that's like a big. I like the idea of incarnation, and for me that takes the form of like imagining other possible universes, like if I did this other thing instead of that thing, then there would be a whole different reality now, and as it stands, it's only there in imagination. So if I had, a charm to bestow, I think it'd be something like, getting to sort of swap, to walk from one, universe into the other universe of these kind of parallel worlds, that where you get to sort of see what it would have been like if you'd made that other decision somewhere way back when, or if someone, someone prior to your own life, had done something different. You'd had this alternate history play out to get to kind of, in some form, pass between those parallel worlds. I don't know if you'd get to sort of affect things in them. That might be sort of the cost, right? Like you lose your agency, and you just get to sort of go and visit them. And you have to come back to your own world ultimately. Something like that.
Wow, Wes, you really just took it to that level. That's like one of those sort of truth level items in a world, right? Like
for real, that's a serious gift.
Yeah, that's like one of the like 4 primordial items created in the mythology of a world level gift. So well done. Yes, I'm going to share my measly little gift in a while, but I'm also going to think of something of mythological, cosmic proportion like that, because wow, very good. It actually makes me think a little bit of Beauty and the Beast, but I suppose that's a little bit different, or any mirror or thing that shows us. I guess to some extent, this book or any story we look at is sort of a mirror of a different place like that, but still not quite the same way as the world that would be if you had acted in that way. That I think is something I always imagined would be a part of something like a heaven. But yeah, Sarah, so what do you think after that?
Well, I'll just go the alternative extreme route, which is like practical charms.
Also,
like if we're talking stocking stuffers, like some, at least in my house, like where you get socks and stuff. And because it's December and it's sort of like what I was thinking about was like and honestly, I'm sort of thinking on the fly because I didn't know that this was something we were going to talk about, but whatever. Like a single-use time turner. I know
cool. That's cool.
It's a very regulated trick, but I think like the ability to like once get an extra hour of sleep or something like that, and like it would be controlled in the sense that like you'd only have a certain amount of time, and it like the effect of say like falling back every November, but you got like one extra on a weekend. I'm just thinking about like how much I could use that right now.
That's really cool,
and
because it's like a gift card too. In that way.
It is like you can use it when you need it, right?
And you get a limited amount. I think that's spectacular too. Y'all are gonna make me look terrible because that's such a cool, like that makes me want that as a gift just because it's such a perfect gift. So y'all have hit the cosmic level gift, the perfect practical gift. I'm gonna give the total specialist desire here. So you know how Rita Skeeter, who we're soon going to see in Up Close and Personal, has a quill that will write her stories for her that seems to embody her personality and writes of its own volition? Well,
the quote quill.
Yes, I need one of those for grading English essays for my students.
Oh my God, that is genius.
Absolutely.
And I also need it to form a psychic link with me so that I still learn about my students and their personalities and their writing style and how they respond to criticism and how quickly they make adjustments and how much they develop over time. Like I still want that feedback and data. I don't want to ignore them, but I want it done automatically.
That's great. That's like a combination of that cursed quill that Harry has to write, and it like writes into his hand as he writes,
Yes.
with Rita Skeeter's automatic quick quotes quill. So it's like you're getting it to write automatically. You're also having it inscribed on you, so you never forget it at the same time. Yeah, that would be a really handy thing to have. But the closest
God,
thing,
so handy. Oh my God.
Very handy.
copy paste though. I mean, like, let's go. Like you can fill in a lot of things if you get your essays turned in electronically, and then you go through and do a little copy paste. That's just a thought.
That's smart.
I use turnitin.com, and I know we're not being sponsored by them, but if we were, it'd be the easiest sponsorship in the world. And they have like the feedback studio where I basically just drag and drop my common comments, like sentence fragment, or this isn't well thought out, like say more, or you need better evidence. And I have like a bank of terms. It is kind of magic. And then I like type a comment at the end, but.
Well, that's great. And y'all may have just given me my Christmas gift, and asking you shall receive indeed. And, it does draw people's perspective to your problem when you ask. And that's something well worth knowing, I think, for our listeners. And I think that is the magic of a spell, that is what a good question does, right? It draws people's attention to something of value, and then they extract additional information. And, well, hopefully that's what this is. Even though we're talking about a magical world, this magical world is nested within our very real world. And it seems to be a wonderful whetstone against which we're sharpening ourselves. And I think tonight was a fine conversation. And, Merry Christmas, y'all.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. I hope to talk to you guys again in the new year.
God bless us, everyone. Yeah, I'll talk to you guys later.